Mom, you said you had a brain hemorrhage, which might leave you paralyzed and in need of care. The day after my mother collapsed, I tearfully told my husband and mother-in-law who met me. Then my husband, a little surprised, says something like this.
Huh, elderly care? Why don't you just put her in a cheap facility?
Hey, you're joking, right? She's my only mother. As I strained to say this, my husband chuckled dismissively.
You married into this, so your family is irrelevant. And of course, I won't shell out for any facility costs, so don't come leaning on me.
Taking advantage of the situation, my mother-in-law, who had been tormenting me, chimed in. Just as my son says, that old hag should just drop dead already. I reached my breaking point. I could endure their mistreatment towards me, but not when they spoke ill of my mother. I'll never forgive them. I'll show them someday, I vowed. A year later, the chance for revenge came. My name is JC, and I'm a 29-year-old housewife. Originally, I lived with my mother while working at a large corporation. My father passed away when I was in elementary school. Since then, my mother Sylvia raised me alone. I loved my mother dearly. She always watched over me with a gentle smile, despite not being economically privileged. My mother worked 2 jobs and raised me to be independent. I wanted to make life easier for her, so I excelled academically and joined my dream company. When I got the job, my mother was overjoyed, saying, "I'm glad your dream came true." In the department I joined, my senior colleague, Curtis, later became my husband. Curtis mentored me as a training supervisor, and our relationship grew intimate. We started going out for meals together, and our relationship officially began with his confession. Quiet and with little romantic experience, Curtis continuously took the lead with me. We progressed smoothly in our relationship, and he proposed to me when I was 26.
JC, will you marry me? I'm sure I'll make you happy.
Thank you, Curtis. As I blissfully put on the offered ring, Curtis spoke to me.
Well then, I need to go and meet your mother, JC.
Yes, I'm sure my mom will be happy too. Wrapped in Curtis's embrace, gazing at the nighttime panorama, I felt an overwhelming sense of bliss. After a while, we decided to visit my mother for the wedding announcement. Upon hearing the news, my mother teared up with joy. JC, I'm really happy for you. I'm truly delighted, dear. Oh, Mom, don't cry. Curtis, you've taken good care of my daughter. Please continue to make her happy. Upon hearing this, Curtis straightened his back and replied,
Of course. I'll do my best to reassure you. You raised your daughter so well on your own. I will do my best.
I looked at Curtis with such reassurance. The following week, it was time to visit Curtis's parents for the introduction. His parents were already divorced, and he was currently living with his mother in their family home. To avoid being disrespectful to my future mother-in-law, whom I was meeting for the first time, I paid attention to my attire and hairstyle. I prepared a high-quality gift of sweets and headed to my future in-law's house. Nice to meet you, I'm JC. When I nervously made this introduction, my future mother-in-law scanned me from head to toe. Oh my, Curtis, you surprised me. I never expected you to bring such a plain person. Hearing these words as the first thing said, I involuntarily froze. That's when Curtis said something like this.
Easy there, Mom. Isn't she better than a flashy, extravagant spender?
Well, yes, but I was hoping for someone a bit cuter. And this gift box is in poor taste. Couldn't you have brought a cake with a bit more thought? Saying this, she casually tossed the box of baked goods I gave her onto the dining table. I'm sorry. My mother-in-law snorted at me as I got smaller and took a seat. Curtis urged me to sit next to him.
So, Mom, I want to marry her.
As Curtis announced this, his mother-in-law sighed. Well, Curtis, you are at the age to get married, I suppose. I'll allow it. Oh, thank you. But you, young lady, why don't you quit your job and move in with me? Huh? I looked at Curtis in panic. I had already communicated to him that I wanted to continue working even after marriage, and of course I assumed we would be living together. But Curtis responded happily.
Oh, of course, Mom. That's what being a wife is about, right?
I was left dumbfounded. After a while, the gathering dispersed, and when we were alone, I protested to Curtis. Hey, Curtis, I told you I want to work even after marriage.
Oh, that? I was planned to have you quit once we got married.
What are you talking about?
It's awkward to have your wife in the same company. Besides, I don't want to be seen as a man who can't support his wife on his own income.
With an attitude that seemed natural to him, Curtis continued, and even though I felt dizzy, I persisted. And what about living together? I thought we would have our own place.
Huh? Did we talk about that? I live with my parents, so if you're coming in as my wife, living together is a given.
But our homes are far apart. The distance between our parents' homes was about a 2-hour drive, and I was uneasy about being separated from my mother. Unaware of my concerns, he continued.
What? Coming in as my wife means leaving your parents' house and entering your husband's house. It has nothing to do with your parents, right? My mom is going to be your mother now.
But...
So you want to call off the marriage? Your mother would be very disappointed, considering how happy she was.
With a threatening tone, Curtis says such things. In the end, I agreed to quit my job and live with his parents. It was tough to leave the company I had worked hard to enter and to move away from my mother, but my mother said this to me. JC, that's what marriage is. Do your best to get along with Curtis and his mother. Mom, I understand. And so, after the wedding with Curtis, I moved in with his parents. On the first day of living together, my mother-in-law told me, "From today, all household chores are your responsibility. Do them properly." My mother-in-law didn't work, so I thought household chores would naturally be shared. Still, to avoid conflicts, I reluctantly started unfamiliar household tasks at my in-laws' home. During this time, my mother-in-law watched TV and ate snacks. It seemed she hadn't done much housework before, as their home was quite messy. I was frantically wiping down the place. Before finishing the cleaning, I had to prepare dinner and tidy up the laundry. When Curtis came home and we sat down for dinner, my mother-in-law commented, "What's this meal? It's too bland." Although I followed a recipe from a book and tasted it, thinking it was delicious, my mother-in-law began adding salt and pepper. Curtis followed suit.
It's indeed bland. Did you make this, JC?
Yes.
Mom, teach her the taste of the Smith family. You're a housewife, so at least cook properly.
Yes. As I was scolded by Curtis, my mother-in-law looked pleased. After that, the harassment from my mother-in-law continued. I was constantly criticized for household matters. At times, she even made snide remarks about my mother, such as, "I wonder what she taught you at home." When I complained about it, Curtis did not side with me, but rather sympathized with my mother-in-law and blamed me. This kind of life continued for about a year, and I lost a lot of weight due to stress. Still, thinking about how happy my mother was about the marriage, I couldn't bring myself to suggest a divorce right away. At that time, I received a call on my mobile phone. Hello? Yes? What? Mom? The call was from a local major hospital. My mother had collapsed while she was out and was rushed to the hospital. Her condition was extremely critical and they wanted me to come immediately. At that moment, my mother-in-law was out visiting a friend and Curtis was at work. I sent a message to Curtis and left a note for my mother-in-law, then hurriedly left the house. At the hospital, I was informed that my mother had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. The surgery was successful, but there might be lingering paralysis in limbs or speech, and she might need additional caregiving. That's what the doctor told me. My mother had a cerebral hemorrhage? Needing caregiving? What should I do? While internally panicking, I continued holding my mother's hand. Later, as my mother's condition stabilized, I decided to go back home for the time being. Upon returning home, my husband and mother-in-law were waiting for me.
A full-time housewife leaving the house overnight. What's that all about? Thanks to you, my mom and I had to go out for dinner yesterday.
My text messages have been read. Despite knowing the situation on my end, Curtis didn't rush to the hospital, but instead says such things. But I sent a text message and left a note, right? My mother collapsed and I had no choice but to go. Then my mother-in-law, seemingly disinterested, remarked, I don't care about such things. Just hurry up and do the accumulated housework. With a husband and mother-in-law who doesn't worry about my mother, I pleaded with tears in my eyes. They said my mom had a brain hemorrhage, which could possibly leave her paralyzed and in need of care. Curtis seemed somewhat surprised and responded,
Huh? What do you plan to do now?
I still don't know, but if caregiving becomes necessary, I'll have to do it. Please understand. Then Curtis came up with this.
Huh? Caregiving for an old person? Why not put her in a budget facility or something?
Huh? Even my mother-in-law, with a sly smile, joined in, saying, That's right. Don't neglect your household chores over caregiving for your mother. Hey, you're joking, right? She's my only mother. As I uttered those words, Curtis chuckled dismissively.
That's why you got married, right? Your family has nothing to do with us. Of course, I won't pay for any facility costs, so don't come relying on us. Even my mother-in-law, who had been tormenting me, took advantage of the situation. Curtis is right. That old hag should just drop dead. I reached my limit at that moment. I could endure their terrible treatment towards me, but I couldn't tolerate them speaking ill of my mother. I swore to never forgive them, and I vowed to show them someday. Silently, I turned on my heel and headed to my room. By then, my love for Curtis had completely vanished, leaving only intense hatred for my mother-in-law and husband. However, I couldn't act immediately. I didn't know what the future held for my mother, and I wasn't employed. I wanted to not only part ways with them, but also inflict some damage. Afterwards, despite complaints from my mother-in-law and husband, I continued visiting my mother in the hospital. Fortunately, her surgery went well, and the paralysis was mild. After about 6 months of rehabilitation, she was deemed fit for home care. JC, I'm sorry for causing you worry. Are you bothering Curtis or your mother-in-law? My mother, in the midst of her own struggles, was still concerned about my relationship with my in-laws. I could only hold her hand and smile. Meanwhile, at my in-laws' house, my mother-in-law and husband started criticizing me for neglecting household chores due to my mother's situation. Don't slack off on housework just because of your mother. What kind of daughter-in-law are you? My mother-in-law glared at me as I silently did the housework. Curtis joined in. Yeah, it was tough back then, huh, Mom? I'm sorry for marrying a woman who lacks self-awareness.
That's right, Curtis. That's why I opposed the marriage.
I should have thought more. I'm sorry for causing trouble for you, Mom.
It's not your fault, Curtis. It's all because that woman is a failure. I acted as if I didn't hear their words. Gradually, I stopped talking in this house and became like a household robot. Despite that, my mother-in-law and husband continued their verbal abuse without a care. Meanwhile, I recorded their rants and continued to study for my certifications. I was determined to be able to support myself even after parting ways with Curtis. I kept trying, sometimes in between chores, sometimes even cutting back on my sleeping hours. About a year after my mother fell ill, while doing housework, my phone rang. Are you Mrs. Curtis Smith? Actually, it was an employee from Curtis's company who delivered the message with a tense voice. Curtis had been involved in a traffic accident while out on business and was urgently transported to the hospital. After hanging up the phone, I calmly informed my mother-in-law of the hospital where he was admitted. Curtis had an accident? I must go immediately. You prepare for his hospitalization and come right away, understood? My mother-in-law rushed out of the house with a changed expression. On the other hand, I remained quite composed. I took care of some errands and returned home, enjoying a rare night alone. The next day, I leisurely woke up and headed to Curtis's hospital. As soon as I opened the door to the hospital room, my mother-in-law's angry shouts greeted me. Too late! What are you doing when Curtis is in such a critical condition? I ignored her and approached Curtis's bed. Curtis weakly opened his eyes. Curtis is partially paralyzed. His spine was injured in the accident. My mother-in-law began crying beside the bed, and Curtis meekly spoke.
It turned out like this, but I want to go home. JC, I'm counting on you for caregiving from now on.
Ignoring his words, I smiled and took something out of my bag. It was the divorce agreement I had received the day before. My part was already signed. Curtis, please proceed with the divorce.
Huh?
As my mother-in-law and husband's eyes widened, I told them matter-of-factly. You told my mother to go to a facility, right? Does that scum of a husband need caregiving? Why not go to a budget facility yourself? What are you saying? My mother-in-law murmured with a trembling voice. I ignored her and handed the divorce agreement with a smile. You can sign it when you're able to get up. I'll be leaving today, so why don't you and your mother help each other and live together?
Hey, JC, you're joking, right? You're not going to abandon me in this state, are you?
As Curtis pleaded with tears welling up, I retorted, Who abandoned my mother a year ago? Who's going to take care of someone like you? It's karma. Serves you right. Just go to hell, both of you scumbags. Leaving Curtis and my mother-in-law dumbfounded, I walked away. Later, I moved my belongings to my parents' house before my mother-in-law returned. Since we had discussed it in advance, my mother warmly welcomed me back. After a contentious process, Curtis and I divorced. The recordings of Curtis and my mother-in-law's verbal abuse worked in my favor, and I received a fair share of assets. Curtis returned home, and his care fell upon my mother-in-law. Despite receiving insurance money, he couldn't continue working and ended up resigning from his job. He became almost bedridden at home, spiraling into despair. Now my mother-in-law is reportedly struggling to care for him. I heard that my mother-in-law too aged considerably and turned completely white-haired due to the fatigue of caregiving. Despite knowing that, I could only think that it serves her right for the suffering she caused. On the other hand, I returned to work while living with my mother. Thanks to the qualifications I had studied for, I secured a job with similar conditions to my previous one after changing jobs. Fortunately, my mother is doing well and enjoying her hobbies. From now on, I plan to work hard while supporting my mother and strive to brighten my own life.